Jason Haber, District 32 Justice, Foundation Vice Chair. Good afternoon. It's my privilege to introduce Congresswoman Donna Shalala. Congresswoman Shalala represents Florida's 27th District in the United States House of Representatives. For those of you that don't know, that's down in the Miami area. Prior to entering the halls of Congress, Donna Shalala had a distinguished career in public service and education. Donna Shalala served as president of Hunter College and chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 1992, President Clinton nominated Donna Shalala to join his cabinet as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Secretary Shalala was the first Lebanese American to serve in a president's cabinet and is the longest serving HHS secretary. In 2001, Donna Shalala moved on to what I'm confident she will agree with the greatest job on the planet, president of the University of Miami. And I know I'm only on some screens, but go Canes. President Shalala led the University of Miami for close to 15 years. After stepping down from that position, she became the president of the Clinton Foundation. I had the pleasure of meeting President Shalala as an undergrad at Miami. And back then, there was a joint history and English class that was all on the 60s. If you could picture a whole semester on one decade. And she came to speak about her experiences and talked about her volunteerism that started by serving in the Peace Corps in Iran and how that set her off on a career of public service. Throughout her tenure at Miami, President Shalala raised the bar year after year, proving to be a force to be reckoned with. For these reasons and so many more, the Phi Alpha Delta International Executive Board has awarded Congresswoman Donna Shalala with the Tom C. Clark Award. Donna Shalala's dedication to public service is immeasurable. I could go on, but without further ado, here is Congresswoman Donna Shalala.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm unmuted now. Thank you very much. And thank you for the Tom C. Clark Award. You know, I was thinking I collect trivia, and here's what I remember about Mr. Justice Clark. He didn't testify before Congress at his confirmation. He said that that would compromise him. So as far as I know, he may be the only justice that was confirmed that actually refused to testify. I don't know whether that would happen today. And the other thing I remember about him, which is important for today, is that he was a Southern justice who believed in civil rights. He of course, voted with Brown versus the Board of Education, but he also wrote the majority opinion in Mapp versus Ohio and the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. I mean, there were some very critical issues that he addressed and took the lead of in the Supreme Court. He had such integrity that to give his son the opportunity to be Attorney General, he resigned from the Supreme Court and went back to Texas. So it's an honor to receive an award that's named after Mr. Justice Clark. While you couldn't characterize him, those of you who studied the Supreme Court probably couldn't characterize him as either a liberal or a conservative, which is closer to my politics. He certainly was on the right side of history on a whole set of fundamental rights issues. And frankly, we need more like him on the Supreme Court of the United States and on all of our courts. I am not a lawyer. My mother was, and she thought I should go to law school. I was actually accepted at law school and went off to the Peace Corps and I never got back to law school. But I think I will start because you asked me to talk a little about my career as part of this presentation. When people ask me what the most important job I've ever had or what the most fun was, it's very easy for me to answer that question because it was as a Peace Corps volunteer. I was 20 years old. I was stationed in a mud village in southern Iran. And you learn a lot about yourself, particularly when you're living as a woman in a Muslim country. But you learn a lot about poverty and about the character of people and about the difference between cultures. But most importantly, you learn how to get things done. when you're faced with cultural differences, with ideological differences, and with, frankly, a clear discrimination against women. And so I always go back to my Peace Corps experience because it strengthened me inside. It made me much more self-confident. Even though I came out of college probably a little arrogant, it shaved off whatever edges I had because of the challenges of living in a country like Iran. The second thing people ask me is did I plan either to be a college president or to be a cabinet officer or to run for Congress? And the answer is no. I've never had a grand plan. Young people come to see me. I remember at the University of Miami, everybody came to see me and they wanted to know how they should lay out their grand plan for their career. And I said, just be awake and take advantage of opportunities, because that is essentially what my career has been about. I went to graduate school after the Peace Corps and after wandering around the world for a year. I went to graduate school because I was following my boyfriend. That's the only reason I went to graduate school. It was not part of a grand plan. I loved it. He hated it. He left. I stayed, and I ended up with a Ph.D. But I really wanted to be a journalist. So I wrote to the New York Times and to the Washington Post. I had already, during the summer of my college years, had experience at the Cleveland Press. And neither one of them had jobs. And my major professor said, finish your PhD. If you really want to go to New York, I'll get you a job at one of the universities. So I ended up at Columbia, and I ended up as an academic who loved politics, who loved writing about politics and participating in politics. And the rest is sort of history. Opportunities came up. I had a chance to go into government early on in my career. I spent 3.5 years in the Carter administration, then went back to be president of Hunter College in my 30s. From there, I went to the University of Wisconsin to be chancellor. I never planned on ending up running universities, but basically I've had a classic career where I've been in and out of government and always went back to the academy. In large part, not because I fell in love with running universities, but because I fell in love with young people and with the opportunity to teach. And so all the years that I was at Wisconsin, at Hunter College in New York, at the University of Miami, I taught every semester and taught large classes because that was the way I could understand the constituency that I was responsible for. So that gives you a kind of a snapshot, but it was really, someone picked up the phone and called me and said, hey, you might be interested in this job. And I always left jobs when I still loved them. So I had that kind of commitment. When I left Wisconsin, I adored Wisconsin, but you can't turn down a president when they offer you a cabinet post. So even though I did turn down Bill Clinton twice, he offered me education, he offered me HUD. I said, no. I went back to Wisconsin. They said, come back. He's going to offer you something else. He offered me HHS, and I took HHS. So it's a career of opportunities. And I had, but how do you get into a cabinet post? I said to my students once, look around the room, figure out which one of your friends are going to run for president and keep in touch for 30 years. I met the Clintons before they were married. They had known me for years. Hillary and I sat on the board of the Children's Defense Fund. It's those kinds of connections that that make a difference. I knew all of the cabinet except for Janet Reno because we had all either been in the Carter administration together, or we had been in Democratic politics, or we had been on boards. Bob Rubin and Henry Cisneros and I were in the board of the Carnegie Foundation. All of us had been involved with each other before we joined the cabinet. So when we looked around the room, with the single exception of Janet Reno, who none of us knew, Hillary knew her, all of us had known each other for years. But that gives you a sense of networking, what a difference it makes, but also of a career that was really taking advantage of opportunities and making friends along the way. I've never knowingly made an enemy, and I keep emphasizing that to my staff in Washington and here, that I work hard at not making enemies. It doesn't mean that I don't disagree with people, but I try never to make an enemy, always to make a friend, no matter what their ideology or politics is. So let me end there. I'd love to talk, I think we're going to do a Q&A about racism in America, about the healthcare system as it now exists, but that's a little background that they asked me to talk about in terms of a career. What I recommend to people is they be awake when an opportunity involves itself, and also never eat lunch at your desk, because the networking is absolutely critical to future careers. That's the best I can do. But thank you very much for this extraordinary award.
Thank you, Congresswoman. If I can ask everyone, if they want to post their questions in the chat, just direct them to me, and you can choose me on the drop down, and then I'll go ahead and ask them as we go. Just want to start out with one that was, we had a couple of questions related to this earlier. So today we've got a lot of people get their news from different sources, and those sources certainly drive the slant one way or another. So how do you fight, or how do we fight against misinformation?
You know, there are lots of opportunities to correct that information, and we've just got to be committed to science and to the facts. And social media is not a one-way street. You can answer irrelevant or incorrect facts using social media. It's harder today because it's all over the place, but you have to know a lot about what people read. And one of the things that surprised me in the last election was, because I love libraries, I walked into the library, and who was on the library computers but senior citizens who were not getting their news by buying the Miami Herald or the New York Times. They were getting their news online, which, you know, we've always known that young people are always on social media, and there's a lot of literature about how to target and use social media to get your message out. But the fact is that many senior citizens now get their information online as well. So distributing, keeping to the facts, re-emphasizing the facts is very important. And just repetition is the way that you do it. And it's very important for people to know what their sources are, to know what their screening is. If you ask a doctor today what their biggest challenge is, it's that their patients get their second opinions online, and they often have to correct those second opinions. It's a big challenge for all of us. It's a good question.
Another career-related question. What advice would you have for a lawyer interested in getting into university administration as a career?
You know, it's interesting. We do hire lawyers as lawyers in university administration, and most large universities have pretty large law firms. They may contract out for their litigation, or if they're a state university, that gets turned over to the attorney general. But getting into university administration as a lawyer, there are general counsels. They're constantly advertising because they can't compete with the large law firms. And particularly if you have a specialty like healthcare, they're always looking for people, because their lawyers get moved off into private law firms because they don't pay quite as well. The benefits are great, but they don't pay quite as well anywhere near what the private law firms pay. So I've hired a lot of lawyers from private firms over the years, and there are usual openings across higher education for lawyers, but you have to have a specialty, because it's not that you have to be have a specialty necessary in higher education. That's a very narrow field. But specialties in civil rights, in employment law, and in healthcare are particularly valuable to universities.
Another one. dealing with the issue of race, how can we effectively increase representation of attorneys in color in our organization and in the legal field as a whole?
You know, that's by mentoring people early on. There's no question about it. We have to expose young people to legal careers, and that means internships early on, whether it's in high school or in college. But, you know, internships aren't good enough. The best programs I've ever participated in is where you identify a person early on and bring them back time after time, follow them all the way through college, and make sure they have the right credentials to apply to law schools. And then we need law schools to pull them in and to give them those opportunities. But we have to start very early to identify young people and to make sure they know what it takes. The pre-law programs are helpful, but frankly, if the law schools did more by teaching undergraduate courses, they could identify outstanding young people. And I encourage the University of Miami to teach courses for undergraduates, because undergraduates were really interested in issues of the law. And that gives them an opportunity to identify young people who are of color and to make sure we mentor them properly.
You served this prior term with Congressman Lewis. We were wondering if you could reflect upon your experiences with him.
Yeah, you know, I had known John Lewis for 30 years. I actually brought him a couple of times down to Miami to speak at the university. He was an extraordinary human being, soft-spoken. You know, when I first arrived in Congress, he was, Nancy Pelosi gave a dinner for us, and he was wandering around taking pictures basically with everybody, because everybody wanted to have a picture with him. And he got to me and I said, "John, can you believe I'm here?" And he said, "Donna, you belong here." And he couldn't have been more supportive over the years. I had a bill with a couple of colleagues to allow young people to vote at 16 instead of at 18. And everybody was skeptical that we would get any votes on it. So I played the role of a whip, and I went up to John Lewis because I knew he was interested in voting rights. And I knew if I could get him, I could get some other votes. So he said, "Okay, give me your elevator speech." And I explained to him that I thought if we got young people to vote at 16, they would get their civic education in high school, and then they would really vote at 18, because we had trouble with that transition with 18-year-olds, getting them to register and vote. And he thought that was a pretty good argument. So he was surrounded by the Black Caucus, and he turned to all of them and said, "Hey, we're voting for this." We got 136 Democratic votes. We didn't get any Republican votes. The only votes I didn't get that day, and he asked me, "Who didn't you get?" I said, "Everybody that had teenagers at home." He laughed and laughed. He thought every time I saw him, he'd say, "What are we going to do about these parents of teenagers?" But I went to Selma with him last March. I knew it was going to be one of his last trips. I had gone with him before years earlier, but I had a chance to stand on the bridge with him, and that was a very moving experience. He was just a wonderful colleague, just a terrific colleague, but a terrific human being. And he had such an impact on legislation, on the Congress of the United States. When John Lewis got up to speak from the well, everybody stopped what they were doing. It was the only time the entire House was quiet.
That actually is a good segue to another question here. We hear a lot about friction in Congress. Can you tell us about some consensus that you've seen that we might not be aware of, might not make some headlines?
Well, there's less friction in our individual relationships because we work at our individual relationships with the other side. There's a lot of pretty tough politics that's going on. You could see it now in this negotiations. People that are calling my office that are crying because they're unsure where their next check will come from, and they're out of work and they want to take care of their families. And we're struggling to do a negotiations that protects American workers, former workers for the most part, and protects our healthcare workers, our essential workers, our police, our fire, our teachers. So, you know, there just is this ideological spread that wasn't there when I was in. There was some of it in the Clinton administration because, of course, we had Newt Gingrich, and you could see it building, but it didn't extend as much to the personal. I have worked hard to build relationships with Republican colleagues. Mario Diaz-Balart and I passed TPS for Venezuelans and a whole set of bills where we built bipartisan support to help the Venezuelan people. Matt Gaetz and I have a bill, a very important bill on moving marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 for the purposes of research. So I can give you a list. Mario Rubio and I have been working on COVID-19, particularly where we believe that Florida has not gotten their fair share, whether it's a drug that we need to save lives or whether it's the distribution of money for our hospitals. So I've worked very hard at building those relationships, and the personal relationships between Democrats and Republicans are stronger than what you see in the public.
Let me scroll down here for 1 second. You mentioned earlier about not making enemies and how important that is. And this being a fraternal organization, we certainly have our fair share of debates. How do you handle someone that is consistently contrarian and bridge that divide that's there?
With good humor. That's a personality trait, the contrarians. I have a lot of friends that are contrarians. It's not just finding middle ground. It's being respectful and listening. The one thing you learn as a college president is to listen. Because if you don't listen and you don't understand the difference between cultures on your campus, and I'm not talking about ethnicity, I'm talking about the difference between the culture of the law school and the culture of the medical school. And if you don't pay attention, if you're not empathetic, you know, the law requires that we be respectful, but we argue our strong positions. But we shouldn't personalize it. I am mortified that we have politicized COVID-19. People are dying because of that politicalization. And we just got to get over this. There are some things that we just have to do together. And one of them is learning to listen to each other, to argue, to not necessarily end up in agreement, but to respect the other person as a human being.
Dealing with obviously the current national health crisis, what do you draw upon from your experience running HHS to now being in Congress today and trying to come up with legislation dealing with the pandemic?
My deep understanding of federalism and of what's possible in terms of what agencies can actually deliver. I understand implementation better than most of my colleagues because I've been on that side, not just on the policymaking side, but on the implementation side. So that has helped me. My distress is that the President of the United States doesn't understand federalism. He thinks he can take a disease that has no boundaries and delegate the responsibility to the states. And that's not appropriate in almost every case. He needed to take responsibility for the message, for the science, for the purchasing of supplies, and for the investments in the healthcare system, as opposed to delegating things to the states.
So in circumstances, you know, and forgive me, I should actually be referring to everyone's name who's asking these questions. I'm just going down the list, reading a lot of them. So Brother Ron Coleman from one of our district justices asked if you could explain how, when you've got differences politically and professionally, how do you take those fundamental ideas and bridge that gap?
You know, sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can try to find a compromise. Sometimes it's just language. And when we're negotiating appropriations, for example, sometimes it's just compromising on what the number is. But you have to be very nimble to be able to work things out. For example, I convinced a Republican colleague that a bill that we were working on, that it wasn't appropriate to give it to the Department of HHS, because what he wanted was a standard, a national standard for collecting vital statistics. It's a young Republican from Texas. He had been in the state legislature. He knew what the problem was, and he had all sorts of examples. But what I said to him is, HHS doesn't do that. They collect the vital statistics, but setting the standards is, you ought to go to an outside group like the National Academy of Medicine. Well, he didn't know anything about the National Academy of Sciences or the National Academy of Medicine. And once I explained it to him, he changed the bill to get me on it. And sometimes you can't bridge the differences. I mean, we're arguing now between $600 a week and $400 a week for people to get unemployment insurance. $600 a week combined with what Florida pays, which is $270, $75 maximum, gets you barely to $15 an hour. That's not a livable wage. And we know that, and therefore I've urged the speaker not to compromise on that. Whether she will or not, I don't know. But we cannot, as Americans, push huge millions of people into poverty when it's their tax money. And that's the way I think of the money in Washington. I think of it as the tax money that belongs to the people in my district.
So I'm going to go ahead and ask Brother Ed Anderson. He had a question about what is behind you. I'm going to unmute him for a moment to ask that question.
What's behind me? The picture of Darth Maul?
I didn't hear the question.
Oh, sorry. He's moving his. He was going to ask what was behind Congresswoman Shalala, the portrait behind you.
I'm sorry, Brother Peter, I was unprepared to be called on. Do you mean the portrait above or the picture here?
No, the Congresswoman's picture.
Oh, Congresswoman, there is a portrait behind you
Yes.
in the Zoom that we're viewing. I wondered who is portrayed in that portrait, and is that person important to you?
Well, it's me. It's the sketch by the artist that did my formal portrait that's hanging in the HHS building in Washington. And she did a number of sketches. And when I went by, I sat for the portrait, obviously. She was a New York artist. Everybody used these, frankly, these guys in Washington that always did these portraits of cabinet officers. And I wanted a woman artist. So I asked around for a portrait artist in New York. And the person that did it, when I stopped by her studio, I saw the sketch and I said, "What are you going to do with that sketch?" And she said, "No, I'm going to paint over it." And I said, "Can I buy it from you?" And she said, "But it's unfinished." And I said, "Well, I'm unfinished." So I bought the sketch. So I don't know whether you can see it, but it's a beautiful, it's just a glorious sketch. So that's the story behind the sketch. It's the first time in my life I've ever hung up a picture of myself any place, but my designer said it's a piece of art, and it's in my kitchen. I want everybody to know.
We have a question from Brother Daniel Moqtaderi. What is the congressional response, if any, to the disaster in Lebanon?
Well, I'm a Lebanese American, and my colleagues, a perfect example of bipartisan. My colleague, Representative LaHood from Illinois and Representative Graves from Louisiana, they're both Republicans, and they're Lebanese Americans, and I are working on humanitarian aid for the Lebanese, hopefully not to go to their corrupt government, but to get to the Lebanese people. And we have a letter that's being widely circulated in the Congress for signatures. We'll have widespread bipartisan support. Actually, the Secretary of State loves Lebanon. The Secretary of Defense is Lebanese American, as is the Secretary of HHS. And we're all working together to get aid to the Lebanese people. It's a terrible tragedy.
Scroll down here. What changes have you seen, if any, when it comes to interaction with lobbyists in Congress?
When it gets to what kind of lobbyists?
Interaction with lobbyists.
Well, COVID-19 means that we don't have lobbyists at our door every day, but we do have sometimes appointments with lobbyists on Zoom, and we've tried to group them together by issue. You know, I don't think they're much different than when I was secretary. You know, they obviously contribute to campaigns, and but there are limits on how much they can contribute. But you know, they're recognized as lobbyists. Sometimes they're very helpful in terms of the analysis they've done on an issue. You hear a different point of view than you're used to. I do the same thing that I did at HHS. I try to balance them off. If someone is coming in on a surprise billing, for example, that's representing the insurance companies, I make sure that we have someone coming in that are representing the consumers or the patients and the providers, or someone coming in that's representing the hospitals. So we're extremely careful, and we keep track of making sure that we hear both sides from lobbyists as part of the process. But lobbyists, because we're so busy, they often see members of the staff and develop relationships with staff people. You know, you just have to be a grown-up about dealing with lobbyists. Often there are people, I have people that work for me at HHS that are now lobbyists for pharma and for other organizations. Or they're lobbyists that I've known for years in different areas. The most important thing is the same thing that I do in my office, to make sure you've listened to the multiple sides on an issue, and not to commit to support one side or another until you know all the things that surround the issues.
Want to go ahead and bring in Sister Sarah Susie Iberg to ask a question.
Hello, Congresswoman. Thank you so much for being with us. I was just asking, many of our members here go into work for congressmen and women and senators, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you look for in potential staff when you're staffing your office.
You know, I have 1, 2, 3, trying to figure out how many lawyers I have on my staff. I have a number of lawyers on my staff. Probably half my staff are lawyers. You know, my legislative director came from Senator Nelson, and she's a lawyer and has worked on the Hill for a very long time, mostly on the Senate side, though she loves the House side, even though she was supervising 16 people and now she's supervising 4. And she's a real policy expert. You have to have lawyers on your staff because we're dealing with legislation. I'm not a lawyer, but I know a lot about legislation. I mean, I'm sort of trained by lawyers. My chief of staff is a lawyer. She's actually had a military background and then came back from the military, from the Army, and went to law school at Georgetown. So she's a particular expert on finance issues and corporate finance in particular. But I'm on this oversight commission overseeing the new facilities that both Treasury and the Fed have set up, and she really understands those issues. My communications person is a lawyer, which is an advantage because, first of all, most of these people are bilingual, but he's bilingual, but he understands the policy issues. And it's very important to me to have someone that actually understands the substance of the policy doing communication. So we have put lawyers in different spots, whether it's working on legislation or overseeing hearings and things like that. So there are a whole range of jobs for people with legal backgrounds. In my experience in policy making, particularly in healthcare, about half of the people were lawyers and about half of them were policy people. that is, they came out of policy shops, or they had master's degrees in public policy, or they had medical degrees. So it's been a mixture. I once hired someone that had a medical degree and a law degree, David Kessler, to run the FDA. And that was very helpful. That was very helpful. So there are lots of opportunities on the Hill. We pay peanuts compared to either universities, private firms, or if you're in a private practice yourself. But it's a very good experience, depending on what committees your congressperson is on. There's a lot of turnover, and after the election, there'll be a lot of turnover. About half of my people already had experience in the jobs. The other place where we've used lawyers is we have 3 people that deal mostly with immigration issues here in Miami. And having a legal background in immigration issues is also helpful. And there's some turnover there, though most of my staff have stayed so far. So on the Hill, in congressional offices, there are opportunities. The only advantage we have over some other things is if you're getting out of law school, you've practiced a couple of years, and you know something about immigration law, we can help you pay off your loans. Because I think we're paying up to $800 a month for people's loans. So while the salaries are low, we actually can help people pay off loans. We get about $20,000 a year to help our staff pay off their student loans. So there are some advantages of getting jobs on the Hill, no matter what they are in terms of paying off loans. But the biggest compliment I ever got was from the general counsel at HHS, Harriet Rabb, who was a very distinguished lawyer, came out of Columbia Law School, ran all their clinics, so she had wide-ranging experience. She said, "I thought like a lawyer." So I've been well trained by lawyers over the years.
Congresswoman, right now we are certainly in the midst of the campaign season with primaries coming up and then soon the general election. What are your favorite and your least favorite things about campaigning?
I love campaigning because it's all about people. It's all about talking about the issues and talking to people. And I love the interface between policy and politics. I'm not crazy about raising money, even though I'm a legendary fundraiser. All the money that I raised for the University of Wisconsin or Hunter College or the University of Miami, where we raised $3 billion, I was not raising money for myself, ever. I was raising money and telling stories about students and about things we would do with people's money. And I was never asking for such small amounts of money. The max you can give is $2,800 for the primary, and then $2,800 for the general. And I'm going to a lot of people now that gave me millions that I'm asking for that amount. And they're sort of chuckling as I'm asking for small amounts. I'm not fond of asking money for myself or for my race, but you got to do it. And we've got to run every 2 years, which means we're in a constant fundraising mode. But in general, people are nice even when they turn you down. And there are a lot of people that just don't answer the phone. People that I actually know that are just fed up with calls from members of Congress. So we've been able to do a couple of clever things. I don't think I have any of the coffee, but we actually have our own brand of coffee called Cafe La Shalala. And this is one of the cups. And we've been sending it out to donors. The coffee was donated, but the wrap, which says Cafe La Shalala, it's espresso, it's Cuban coffee. We paid for as part of the campaign. So we also have scarves. If I could introduce my dog, he doesn't have a scarf on though. Let me get the puppy. Hey, come on.
grabbing the puppy. When we were freshmen, we had the opportunity to go to the president's house during orientation, and she was the first president who allowed the students to walk through the house.
Yeah.
Before that, you always
Well,
walked around the side and into the backyard. And
Well, I campaign in dog parks, and we actually have scarves that say "Dogs for Donna." So we've tried to do some interesting things. This is my new puppy. He was running around. He's actually not a puppy. He's 4 years old. He was running around. He's half asleep. He was running around in Coconut Grove for 2 months. No one could catch him. Finally, he ran into Strata Restaurant, and the owner took him home, called a rescue group, and 2 months later they called me and said, "Hey, we got this cute little dog." I've never had a little dog before. And why don't you come and see him? And I sort of fell in love. And they said, you have to give him an Italian name. So his name is Fauci. So he is named after Tony Fauci, my good friend. He's a COVID dog. So Fauci, say hello to everybody. He's yawning. You can't do that with lawyers.
what is the craziest thing that's ever happened to you on the campaign trail?
Oh, what's the craziest thing that's ever happened to me on a, oh boy, that's not an easy question. I suppose the craziest things that happened to me is when you're campaigning, and particularly in Little Havana, and someone comes up and gets in your face and calls you a communist. And then runs around you calling you a communist. And I just start laughing. The idea that I'm a communist is pretty funny to me. One of the fun things that happens in Little Havana, which I represent, is that they always invite me to join their game of backgammon. So I'm well known around that plaza. And when I go, they call me La Shalala. La Shalala. And when I walk through the airport workers say, La Shalala, I voted for you. I, of course, have Cuban cousins. I'm Lebanese, but my cousins went all over the world. When my grandfather came here, his first cousins went to Cuba and to Argentina and to Mexico. So they call me now La Shalala.
Thank you. We have a question here from, so you last served in government when you left office, or left the Department of HHS in 2001 when President Clinton left office. And then obviously you were at the University of Miami the bulk of this time, but what was it about the 2018 midterm election that made you decide to jump back into public life?
Actually, I got back into government after that because President Bush asked me to co-chair with Senator Dole a commission on wounded warriors to look at the issues of how the most devastated young people coming back from the wars were being treated by the VA system and by the military. So I actually jumped back into government for a couple of years to head that commission with Bob Dole. What got me into the election, I just got pissed off with what was going on in Washington. Literally, in the spring of 2018, which meant people had been running for a year and a half. They were pretty angry with me. But I didn't think that any of them could actually win the district and flip it from the Republicans, because I believed that it was a purple district and it really required someone with a lot of credentials who could bridge between independents and Democrats and Republicans could win the district. So I did a poll. All the poll told me was that I had big name recognition. Didn't tell me a lot about the politics. And took a lot of work and a lot of fundraising, but I won the race, obviously.
Can you let us know, you may know this, we have a silent auction that we raise money for the Phi Alpha Delta Foundation, and I've had a couple of requests for maybe if, the campaign would be so kind as to donate one of those mugs.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We also have T-shirts that say, I'm a freshman but not a rookie. So you tell me what you want from our store and I'd be happy to provide it.
Oh, we appreciate it.
And I'll give you coffee with it.
Fantastic. I could use some of that today.
Just send me the address for where we need to send it.
What are you most proud of your accomplishments in your time in Congress?
You know, there are a number of bills that I really care about. I care about the TPS for Venezuelans because Venezuela has been devastated. But, you know, I've always been focused on young people, and I had a chance to be the lead sponsor on the bill that will take away flavors and raise the age to 21 for e-cigarettes. That's a huge public health issue. And we passed that bill with bipartisan support. Now, the Senate hasn't taken it up. The president's done a little on the subject, raising the age, for example, but we were in the lead on that issue, and that's a really substantial public health issue. I had worked on tobacco in kids for a long time, and we had reduced the number of kids that started to smoke, and then e-cigarettes were introduced, and we've got a serious problem now with e-cigarettes. And I was also the lead sponsor on the drug bill to let the Secretary of HHS negotiate directly with the drug companies to reduce drug costs across the board. So on a number of healthcare issues, I'm very proud of what I've been able to accomplish. And also issues that involve our district, sometimes just a small amendment that will make a difference. The Underline, which is one of my favorite nonprofits here, we made them eligible for a grant program under the new transportation bill so they can get their projects completed. I mean, we did a lot of things. Probably the biggest thing I did in Florida was getting $250 million for the Everglades restoration. A very good friend of mine who was a lawyer, who many of you knew, Mary Doyle, was the author of the Everglades Restoration Act. And I promised her before she passed away that I would do everything I could to get the federal government to actually put their share in place. And the state had always put their share in place. And we were able to do it last year and able to do it this year with bipartisan support.
Got a few more minutes here, so just going to round out with a couple more questions. Obviously, COVID has changed our daily lives, and one of the things that have come out that we've seen is the inequitable impact in different communities throughout the country. Do you have, or are you aware of any legislation that's kind of in the mill on its way out that would resolve some of those inequities?
Well, the police, the Lloyd Police Act that we passed, obviously is one of them. We passed the Equality Act earlier. We've passed in the House changes in the Affordable Care Act that will reach more minority communities, since our state and many southern states have not extended Medicaid to low-income families. And I think all the work we've done on education and on child care, but we've created these inequities through limited legislation, and we're systematically making sure that every piece of legislation we pass. We complained about the SBA PPP loans, and we got better targeting to minority businesses, and we got an expansion of who could loan the money, so minority businesses could go to community banks to get their loans. So I think that we're more than paying attention, we're recognizing that it's our responsibility to eliminate these inequities in healthcare, in education, in the justice system, I mean, all across the board. And we're taking responsibility for the design of programs.
I'm going to take a little bit of a privilege of taking the last question here. One of the chapters of our fraternity is the Rasco chapter from the University of Miami, and we often have a very large number of justices from that chapter, and I think that's the same here today. So we're coming up on a football season. Do you have any predictions?
Well, the only prediction is whether they're actually going to play or not. If they're going to play, I've got great confidence in our coach, but it's not clear to me, even though the ACC has announced the schedule, as long as we have community spread, whether it's going to be possible. So I'm praying that it's possible, but we'll have to see. It'll be, unless we get control over COVID, unless we hit it with a hammer and starve it in Florida and across the South, it's going to be difficult.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Shalala. It's
Oh,
now
my
my
pleasure.
honor. It's now my
Thank
honor
you.
to present
Thank you for the award. And let me know about the cup or anything else, any kind of stuff that swag I can give you for your fundraising.
Oh, we appreciate it. And this award every year is presented to an individual for their contributions to society in advocating, promoting, and exemplifying the principles of equal justice under the law in keeping with the spirit of Tom C. Clark. You are most deserving of this award, and your public service is absolutely amazing. Congratulations, and we appreciate you joining us.
My pleasure. This was fun. And keep in touch.
Thank you so much.